Okay. Well, welcome to you all to this special Vying for Victory, Britain's Navy, Army and Air Force in Myth and Memory, which is part of the National Army Museum, Royal Air Force Museums and National Museum of the Royal Navy's commemorations of V-Day, 75 years ago on Friday, the 8th of May. And I'm joined for a discussion this afternoon by Matthew Sheldon, Executive Director of Museum Operations, National Museums of the Royal Navy, Dr. Harry Raffal, historian of the Royal Air Force Museum, and Dr. Peter Johnston, Head of Collection Research and Academic Access at the National Army Museum. Welcome to you all. Thanks for coming on board. And I'm rather rubbing my hands together at the prospect of this one. I mean, vying for victory and vying for memory, more importantly, is such an interesting one, isn't it? And the biases that have come through since 1945 and the mythology that has taken hold is also really, really interesting, I think. One of the things I just want to start off with is a quote from that legend that is Field Marshal Earl Alexander of Tunis, one of the greatest British commanders we had, and certainly the most experienced battlefield commander, probably on any side in the Second World War. He's the only commander, I think, to have commanded troops in battle at every rank possible, from second lieutenant all the way up to Field Marshal. Anyway, he said in 1943, the secret of modern warfare is a correlation of the three elements we live in: land, air, water. Army, Air Force, and Navy must become a brotherhood. And, you know, I think he's bang on the money. And I think what's really interesting about the Second World War is that you see that Britain and the United States, particularly Britain and her dominions, so I include Canada and Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, etc. in that. They are definitely fighting by that middle stage of the war, a kind of, well, all stages of the war, a tri-service operations where you see the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, I suppose, particularly much more sort of land-centric. Japanese less so, of course, but certainly the core of the Axis powers is a kind of land kind of conflict, really. We're not fighting that way. I'm going to turn first to you, Matthew, if I may. I mean, what's your take? My personal view is that the Royal Navy gets, you know, despite being the senior service in 1939, gets probably the least plaudits, and yet the Battle of the Atlantic, I think one can argue, is the most important battleground, albeit on water, of the entire Second World War.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm going to agree with that. You know, the Navy is the senior service, but I think when we look at myth and memory, it'll be interesting to look at the reasons for why perhaps the Navy hasn't earned its place in the sun.
Sure.
But I think it's important. We often think when we think about VE Day, and I guess here we are, 75th anniversary of VE Day, we think about the road to liberation and ultimately May 45. But if you'd kind of just allow me a little bit of a kind of long perspective, because I think the thing about the Navy, let's look at it in 1939. It went into that war with a strategy that was about a long war. It was going to be about blockade. It was going to be about, you know, choking economic supply to a continental enemy, and, you know, getting all the benefits and the long approach that it took in the First World War. I think that's really important. Clearly, that changes radically, you know, when you get our withdrawal from the mainland in June 40, and, you know, that long campaign doesn't look so good in an era of blitzkrieg, and it doesn't look so good when you lose your ally France and you then, you know, have an enemy who has access to the Atlantic. So I think it's important. I think one of the things I want to give credit to the Navy for is the way that it's able to react and build some new navies, so that by 1943 you've got a coastal forces navy, or you've got combined operations that can take on a different role, you know, and can get us back onto the mainland, and then you start to see the push and so on. But I mean, I think it's worth starting with Battle of the Atlantic, James, if you're happy. I mean, it's you've set us quite a challenge to summarize these things in 5 to 7 minutes, because, you know, Battle of the Atlantic happens, you know, we fight in the North Atlantic in September 39, and we have to keep that control right through to May 45. There are, you know, over 1 million square miles of sea. that
Yes.
over 1,000 North Atlantic convoys alone, there are hundreds of convoy actions, and the phases. I mean, it's such a long war. I think that allows many adjustments and developments through the war, whether they are operational, tactical, strategic, whether they're to do with our allies. So the complexity is incredible.
I mean, we're set up right from the word go, aren't we, to fight it is our belief that this is going to be another long attritional war in which access to resources is going to win out.
Yeah.
So the first challenge, once the Germans attack in 1940, is to resist that, avoid any kind of invasion, so that you can then concentrate for the long haul. So the first challenge is that, and actually the Royal Navy meets that very well, because although Norway is a land defeat for the British and French, it is most absolutely unquestionably a naval victory for the Royal Navy.
Yeah.
Then you've got the great naval triumph of Dunkirk, and Dunkirk is not all about the little ships. I would say about 5%. Would you agree with that? Is lifted by little ships?
Yeah.
I mean, most of the 338,000 are lifted by large ships and those from the Royal Navy. Organised.
Yeah, and I think we should remember that quite often those little ships are crewed by naval personnel. And you should remember the people who weren't just taken off from Dunkirk, but came out of the other French ports, through naval vessels. So. And then I think you're right. The connection to Norway, which we think of as a disaster, I think is important, because we really sink a significant part of the German destroyer force there. And that means that we're able to do those destroyer operations at Dunkirk and lift people off. So I think you're right. I think in a lot of ways, the most intense part of the Navy's war is up to 43. It takes its most significant losses in personnel in 41 and 42, most significant sinkings of ships in 42. And then what it fights from 43 and 44 onwards is not always typical, because it is then focused. It's having to fight an amphibious war that it didn't prepare for. Didn't spend any of the 1930s training in joint exercises or building the ships that it's going to need to go back for amphibious landings. So I think it's quite an intense early war for the Navy, which is important.
And also the scope of it, isn't it? I mean, obviously the Atlantic is the number one, and it's not just about sending ships out there and building vast numbers of corvettes and more destroyers and all the rest of it. It's actually about technology. It's about developing the cavity magnetron, which enables a massive reduction in size of radar, so that it can fit on a corvette or a destroyer. It's about improvements in high frequency direction finding. It is about just the organization of it, of Western approaches up Liverpool and the command center there. It is about maintaining operations in the Mediterranean. It is about supporting what's going on in the Far East. The range and scope of the Royal Navy's involvement in World War II is absolutely astonishing.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. If you think about in the early months of the war, it's down in the South Atlantic. You've got the commerce raiders, and you've got that aspect to the war. You've got the battles in the Mediterranean, and you've got retention of a foothold in Malta. You've got something like the submarine service, the fighting 10th, the flotilla that stays in Malta, and through it all is sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of Italian shipping and supplies that are destined for North Africa. I mean, it is, but I think Battle of Atlantic is interesting because of, as you say, the different, almost kind of stepping counter approach that goes on. That as one technological or operational change is made, you have to counter it. And I think sometimes that's tactical. Sometimes it's about the escort groups specializing and working together. It's then them becoming support groups. So they're freed up from actually protecting a convoy. They're actually free to go and hunt and kill U-boats. And, I think people think of it as coming to a peak in the spring of 43 when, Dönitz has to, I think, admit defeat, and there are very high numbers of kills. But in some ways, by late 41, it's going to be tough. But you can see, I think, ultimate victory, because it's also to do with industrial capacity, because we are building the shipping capacity from then, and and it's expanding with new production in the UK, but also in the US, obviously, and that means he's not able to sink as much as we build. And
Yeah,
there's
well,
going to be grim
let's not
times.
forget
But
also that the Liberty ship is designed by Cyril Thompson, who's a Brit who
yeah,
comes from Sunderland. I mean, I would argue that actually we get to a point where we're not going to lose the Battle of the Atlantic by the end of May 1941, because in the 2 months that precede that, March, April, and May, you lose 3 of the greatest U-boat aces of all, Preen, Shepka, and Kretschmer. And because their start base is so small, the U-boat service at the start of the Second World War is so tiny, there isn't that depth of experience to kind of feed a rapidly expanding force. So once you lose those aces, that is really, really crippling. Then, of course, the Bismarck gets lost, plus Enigma machine and Code Code get captured. And that is a game changer, and it's a triumph of British prioritization of research and development.
Yeah, I mean, I think that capture by Bulldog in it's May 41, I think, is
Exactly.
absolutely vital. We then lose control of the ability to read and decrypt the codes, but we get them back again. I think the other thing to talk about, and I think particularly because we have Harry here, is Coastal Command and how they come in. I think from late 41 through 42. And the number of U-boat kills actually that are made by Coastal Command, I think it's probably approaching something like 20%. And that comes in quite late, and that has its own technical innovations as well. And it means
I think it's very important to understand that the Battle of the Atlantic is not just won by the Navy, it's also won by the RAF as well. My last point, before I turn to Harry, I just want to make a point that, of course, that even in August 1944, that is the creation of the Royal Navy's Pacific Fleet. So, it's not like the Royal Navy's effort is diminished at any point in the war. It just keeps going right up until the end, and it really does deserve greater credit, I think. But anyway, thank you, Matthew. I'm going to turn to Harry now, and Harry, I'm sure you would completely agree about the role of the RAF in the Battle of the Atlantic.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think 20% is probably roughly right for Coastal Command, but if we just look at surface aircraft, I think they claim 41% of all U-boat kills in the war, which I think speaks for itself in terms of the significance of aircraft in that battle.
Those amazing, very long-range liberators armed with rockets that were were by 1943 homing in on surface U-boats and hammering them.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand the liberator's role in this, because it can fly over 1,000 miles away from base, stay out there for about 3 hours, and if you compare that to what Coastal Command starts the war with, which is the Hudson, which is able to reach 500 miles and then pretty much turn back, and then the bombers which were in service at that time, which Coastal Command essentially gets when they're outdated, they can reach about the same distance and stay there for 2 hours. So again, you compare that to what they're able to use at the end of a war, and it is a complete sea change. So I think certainly I'd agree the Battle of the Atlantic is one of the most important theatres of war, and it's perhaps indicative of how little attention is given to Coastal Command as well, but it's not widely praised in the RAF.
We can talk about why a little bit later on, but Coastal Command is probably the most unappreciated area of Britain's armed forces in the Second World War, I would say.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about Coastal Command is that it plays an incredibly important part in the Second World War, as of course naval aviation had done in the First World War. But between both the First World War and the Second World War, and immediately post-war, it is the coastal aspects of the RAF which get the heaviest aspects of the cuts. And there's a number of reasons for that, but that is a really interesting aspect of the RAF's experience of the Second World War. The fact that they forget, along with a lot of other lessons, the importance of naval aviation in terms of supporting convoys, anti-U-boat warfare. They relearn those lessons during the course of the Second World War very effectively, and they get to the end of the Second World War. And again, Coastal Command goes right back down in terms of size. That's, of course, all of the armed services are facing these cuts. So it's an interesting aspect. I think it's quite nice to sit between Matthew and Peter, actually, because air power really does play the glue in making surface operations possible. I think it's tempting when you're in these sort of situations to make these grand claims about one side winning the war and it's on its own, and I don't think any of us really can. But what is fantastic about the RAF is that it allows all of the surface operations to take place. If you don't have air superiority, as I think we see countless examples from Norway, Dunkirk is an example perhaps where even though the RAF doesn't gain air superiority and the Luftwaffe isn't able to prevent the naval evacuation, there's certainly heavy losses there which take their toll.
Well, I think you can argue that the Battle of Britain begins on the 23rd of May, which I think is when Fighter Command first enters the fray. You know, a Fighter Command is created and designed specifically to defend Britain, you know, when Britain is imperiled. So the fact that Fighter Command is supporting the evacuation of Dunkirk, and the failure of the Dunkirk would unquestionably have imperiled Britain, goes to show its importance, and I think certainly extends the reach of the Battle of Britain. You know, what's interesting there is the kind of utter failure of dive bombing, but that is a completely separate issue. I think what is interesting about the RAF though is that air power is absolutely central to Britain's rearmament in the 1930s, and indeed Neville Chamberlain, when he's Chancellor of Exchequer in 1935, despite immense amount of pressure from the army, he goes, no, what we need to do is build up our air forces. You know, air forces have got to be absolutely central to it, and central to this bigger strategy is steel, not flesh, which is to use global reach, mechanization, modernity, technology to do as much of the hard yards as you possibly can, so that you keep those at the coal face of war, infantry, armour and all the rest of it, to an absolutely bare minimum, so that you avoid the mass slaughter that was experienced by a generation of young men in Britain between 1914 and 1918. And that is a absolutely confirmed strategy, which is then picked up by the Americans as well, and maintained right through to the end of the war. And air power has an absolutely key part in that strategy.
Yeah, I mean, the mechanisation of Britain's armed forces, I think Peter will probably speak about how the army starts off as a very mechanised force and continues that way. But yeah, air power is an important aspect of it. It does take time to relearn some of those lessons from the First World War. I think we start to see that from North Africa onwards. And of course, there's a lot of debates within the RAF itself is about what is the appropriate application of its air power resources. So we've talked about the Battle of the Atlantic. Of course, that's in direct competition for resources with Bomber Command. And the bombing war continues to be one of the more controversial aspects of the Second World War. You know, it's I think something which because we're talking about VE Day 1945, something we have to talk about. You know, the strategy which keeps on going in terms of area bombing versus precision bombing, which is perhaps an unfortunate term for the Americans to have.
Well, not least because certainly by the middle of early part of 1944, there's not really much in it between the accuracy of daylight bombing and nighttime bombing because of advancements in navigation aids and bomb aiming and sort of new techniques developed sort of later on in 1944 by 617 Squadron, you know, under the command of Leonard Cheshire. I mean, you know, 617 Squadron is, say, the most accurate bombing unit of the entire war, wouldn't you?
I think it is, but what's really important, you're right, is those navigation aids, because by the end of the war, it doesn't take specialist units to get very accurate bombing. They've introduced a new G navigation aid, which is using radio navigation to provide precise points for reaching targets and bomb dropping, and they've devised systems to incorporate that into attacks, and that means you are able to achieve a level of accuracy in terms of reaching targets, and it's been about target selection. And that's the important aspect of the 45 debate. But in terms of tactical air power as well, there's this debate about whether or not the air should be the first and foremost thing you're thinking about, or should it become later on in the plans? And it takes a little while to develop that realization. You need to have hand-in-hand approach when you're developing even naval or ground plans with the air and vice versa.
Well, the development of tactical air power is absolutely astonishing, really, and you know, because the RAF emerges in the Second World War, excuse me, with commands rather than kind of what the Germans do and the Americans do of creating forces, air forces. We have these commands. The creation in late 1941 into 1942 under Mary Cunningham and Tedder in North Africa of the Desert Air Force as a close air support formation, I think is really, really important. And a lot of those lessons, which are then developed further in Tunisia and beyond, then become the part of post-war doctrine in the US Air Force and indeed the RAF. You know, that is where those origins come in. And I think one can argue, and probably argue convincingly, that 8th Army is spared annihilation following the fall of Tobruk on the 21st of June 1942 by the absolute relentless pounding given to the Axis forces following up by the Desert Air Force. I mean, it is absolutely remarkable, and it's as much to do with the skill of the pilots and determination of the pilots in the command as it is to do with the operational level and that ability to leapfrog landing grounds back and forth and keep that pressure on over the front at all times. I mean, it's an absolutely phenomenal effort. And all these are taken forward into Tunisia, then Sicily, southern Italy, and of course, most of all, before D-Day in Northwest Europe.
The North African campaign, it is a battle from airfield to airfield, because that's what allows you to gain command and air superiority over the battlefields ahead, and therefore attack ground troops and support the advance. And you're right about Tedder's Middle East Command. It is essentially the RAF in the Middle East. It has every single resource of the RAF underneath it. And it is very interesting to see how that allows tactical air power to be almost rediscovered.
Yep.
So yeah, it's fascinating.
And we should just make, for those who are not aware, I mean, strategic air power is when air forces are operating on their own steam without any support of the ground troops or naval troops. And tactical air power is when you are directly supporting operations on the ground. I mean, that's a crude explanation, but just so that people know. But Peter, I must turn to you and the Army. The Army also gets not the greatest of press, I have to say, and I think there is a sort of whole school of thought, loosely known as declinists, that basically think that the British were pretty rubbish, and particularly in the Army, and never managed to kind of meet the kind of tactical chutzpah of the Germans. I would disagree with that. I mean, you know, my own research into this suggests that the British Army was pretty good. It was pretty good in 1940. It developed further, and by 1944-45, it was a pretty good unit, pretty good outfit, whether it's be in Northwest Europe or whether it be in the Far East.
Yeah, I mean, as in the interwar period, so in this discussion, the Army does come in third place in the hierarchy of where we discuss things. You know, exactly as you were saying, the Navy was going to be the forefront of Britain's defence, and so therefore took the bulk of the defensive spending. And then there was this idea about the importance of air forces. The bomber will always get through, and so that came in second place. And then behind that, you have the Army. And the British Army of, you know, into 1939 is an organisation that is made up of a variety of conflicting roles, plans, needs. You know, yes, it has a high level of mechanization, absolutely, but it has no real serious armored formations before 1938, so it is lagging on that scale. And also, you know, it's conflicting between what is it actually for. You know, is it to fight in continental Europe? Is it to conduct operations in the empire in sort of lower key counterinsurgency police and stuff? At which point there is no need for armor. There's this assumption that you can't use armor anywhere in the empire, which, you know, actually pervades quite significantly through into the Desert War. You know, you've got these quite scathing assessments of some fairly brilliant generals because who say, well, you know, from the Indian Army, saying, well, they won't ever be able to do anything in North Africa or in Europe because they don't understand armor, and they can't possibly understand armor coming from the Indian Army. So you have this cultural divide that I think exists in the Army that doesn't necessarily exist in other services to the same extent. You know, you have these schools of thought. You've got the British Army per se versus the Indian Army. But I mean, just looking at the Army and coming back to your central point there about the reputation it's had. I mean, I 100% agree with you. I think it's been unfairly maligned due to its performance. And when we talk about myth and memory, and certainly when we do the Q&A about this on Crowdcast at 7 o'clock, following on from this, you know, people will be able to weigh in with their own questions about why this might be. But, you know, when you look at the size of the British Army in 1939, it's what, 224,000, I think, is what
It's tiny.
Yeah, that's what the regular army can call on. And then it's backed up by the territorial army, but, you know, in 1939, that is poorly trained, poorly equipped.
Also, you have to understand that there's no history for having a large army, and B, it's not something that the British public would contemplate, because you only have a large army if you have conscription. And public opinion in a democracy such as Britain wouldn't allow that. And also, where do you put them? You know, the point of the Navy is to protect our sea lanes, not ferry the army about. I mean, you know, we have an alliance with France that we developed in 1939. France has the potential to have a massive army, so they can do the land bits, and we'll do naval power and air power. So there's no need to have a large army. And
well, I mean, there's the idea that, you know, Britain will have a large army, but that large army will be preferably somewhere else. You know, that's a hangover from the Victorian era. That's what the army was for. The army was to hold on to empire, and the Navy was to guarantee the trade. And then increasingly, you have the Air Force delivered into this environment that helps us better protect these areas. But, you know, from 224,000 to 2.9 million by the end of the war is a significant increase. And I think actually what the army shows is it has this amazing ability to rapidly expand and still deliver, but also be extremely effective and learn within that too. You know, we've talked a little bit about the development of air power. We've talked a little bit, Matthew mentioned, you know, very at the beginning about how the Navy changes what it actually does and picks up new specialism. The Army's exactly the same. You know, you have these brand new things that just crop up that the Army just takes on and challenges, and is effectively learning in contact, which is an incredible skill. And that can only really be delivered through an institutional organizational culture.
Also, look at what they achieve in the Far East. You know, in early part of 1942, they're getting absolutely whipped. You know, there's the loss of Malaya, Singapore, then Burma. You know, just 2 years later, in March 1944 rather, you've got the largest clash of troops on the ground in the war against Japan at Imphal. Which is just a superb victory, and is one where they absolutely smashed the Japanese 15th Army. I mean, just completely destroy it.
Exactly. And
by training tactics, use of equipment, all the rest of it, harnessing air power, blah, blah, blah. But it is an incredibly quick turnaround. I mean, you think how long current British Army was in Afghanistan with the most modern technology the world has ever known, and in 14 years can really kind of make much of a dent. In 2 years in the Far East, you're overwhelming an enemy which has completely crushed you just 2 years before.
Yes, and I think actually that Far East element is something that's really important when we do look at the British Army. Too often, when we think about the British Army not being particularly useful in the Second World War, or being ponderous and slow and not really able to capitalise on success, it's because it's very much bound up in this concept of Dunkirk was defeat, and it was quite humiliating, you know, for all the success that the Navy had in getting those soldiers off the beach. You know, it was actually a bit of a, you know, we've been whipped and driven out by a far greater advanced and better German army. And then we don't really revisit the role of the army until Normandy in 44. We completely neglect everything that's happening elsewhere. I mean, you mentioned Alexander right at the top of the program, and you know, Alexander is not only is he a major general in his own right who is achieving considerable success, he is the leading player in Italy. You know, he is not the junior partner in that coalition. No. You know, he is Britain and he is dominant. You know, we're bound up in this idea about, you know, Montgomery and versus Patton and Bradley, and then Eisenhower sitting all over the top of it. And sometimes when we come to talk about, you know, the Second World War, we are just a little bit too North European centric, I think, when it comes to the army, certainly. And when we look further afield, and you look to something like the 14th Army fighting in Burma, you know, 1 million men, that's the largest Commonwealth army Britain ever has. That is a United Nations as well, because 80% of that army is not from Britain. Yes. And the ability to turn that into a coherent fighting force that's based on rigorous, effective, successful training.
30 different ration scales a day.
Yeah.
You know, that's, you know, and it is this operational level that I've been sort of banging the drum for many years. But it is so important that people understand that it is not just about whether you can march forward and fire a rifle or fire a tank, or whether your tank's got a bigger gun than a Tiger, or vice versa. It is about how you maintain that effort all the time.
And the logistics that go into running the 14th Army. You mentioned the ration scales, but also let's not forget, you know, Harry mentioned the development of air power in the Western Desert. You know, the logistical effort of keeping that army rolling. After, you know, from Alamein to Tunisia is absolutely astounding. It's one of the greatest logistical feats the British Army's probably ever accomplished. But again, it's how we pull these things out into wider discussion to help us just better understand. You know, no one's saying that people are wrong because they don't know all this stuff. Yes. When we come to talk about the value of the army, it's just, let's just broaden the conversation out to some of these things.
Well, let's come on to that one, perhaps.
Come in.
Just that's fascinating to me to hear, because I think of the Navy's expansion in the Second World War. So it starts off just around 200,000 regulars, reservists, and it quadruples that and a little more. But the kind of expansion that Peter's talked about is exceptional. You know, the Navy does have to create new navies. You think about actually the Fleet Air Arm, which goes up to about 75,000, and is, you know, vital in the Pacific War. You have to remember that the Royal Naval Air Service was disbanded in 1918 and folded into the RAF. And I'm not going to reheat the pain that still causes people, but it's just, I think the general point about creation of new services, certainly also about use of forces from elsewhere. You know, the Navy operating with the Royal Indian Navy all the way down into Burma and Arakan in a kind of coastal operation. Having to learn to do that is a new way of warfare. But the kind of numbers that Peter is talking about, I can't conceive of. It's an entirely different force. And the cultures and the personnel and the behaviours that had to go with it were so different, I think.
I think we should talk about, let's turn on to kind of sort of myth and memory and how we perceive the Second World War. Because, you know, there is this sort of, I think there is a kind of a theory for a lot of people that goes something like this, that we were unprepared for war, that we were kind of Little Britain, David against the Goliath of the Nazi Moloch, that the few and a few Captain Mannering types kind of sort of managed to kind of keep us at bay. We kind of hung off the shirt tails of the Americans in the war. The Soviet Union took the lion's share of the beating, and eventually we were still there at the end through kind of stint of blitz spirit and just sort of sticking at it. And I kind of think most of that is completely unfair and unjust. And of course, the big markers are the Battle of Britain, D-Day. Those are an Alamein. Those are the kind of ones that everyone remembers. And you know, many aspects of the Second World War have just disappeared from sort of public consciousness, and I think that's a great shame. And I think one of the reasons why D-Day is so important is because you can hop on a ferry and go and see a beach, and it's quite a nice place to go and visit. Whereas you're not really going to be going up into kind of the Northern Atlantic or sort of bobbing around sort of mid-Atlantic, kind of sort of pondering about the Battle of the Atlantic, are you? So those are the kind of problems you have, I think.
Yeah, I think definitely when it comes to the way in which we do remember and talk about this stuff, definitely the physical landscape of memory is very different for different services. You know, I mean, actually at the National Army Museum, we almost sometimes have a bit of a challenge with this, because the majority of the Army's experiences and these great battles that people associate with the Army happened, you know, somewhere else. You know, the Army's not really, some of the Army's greatest moments haven't really taken place within the British Isles. But, you know, it's, if you compare it to somewhere like the Navy, which fights at sea, or the Air Force, which fights thousands of feet in the air, you know, at least you can visit and walk these battlefields. But I think in terms of what we remember of the Second World War, this is fascinating, because you have D-Day as being this great, incredible, amazing effort. And yet people don't really perhaps realise that, you know, there are more British and Canadians at D-Day than there are Americans.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, Hollywood has a huge role to play in all this, doesn't it? Because, you know, America is the biggest part of the film industry in the world. It's got the most money and it's got the most people. And obviously, if you're going to stump up the cash for a new film or a new 10-part TV series about a particular unit in the Second World War, and you're American, you're going to make sure it's American. I mean, you know, what's interesting about Band of Brothers, for example, is no one on Band of Brothers is claiming that Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment won the entire war. That just happens to be a series about a company of paratroopers. But because that is the series which everyone goes to and turns to, there is this interpretation by viewers that is what is being conveyed. But actually, that's not the case. You know, if Britain wants a kind of greater role in D-Day, what we need to do is start making films about landing on Sword Beach, or
it's not even that. You know, I mean, let's look at Varsity. I mean, Varsity is the largest airborne operation ever.
Yes.
That Britain takes part in. You know, that carrying the 6th Airborne takes 1,000 aircraft and gliders. 1,000 aircraft and gliders carry British soldiers alone over the Rhine to drop them. You know, the whole armada, the whole aerial armada of that, it took more than 2 hours for it to cross a given point. It's so long, that aerial. And yet, isn't it amazing when we talk about aerial operations of the Second World War? You know, it's either D-Day because of Band of Brothers, yep, or as Arnhem, which is a spectacular failure, which is in itself a bit of an interesting one. You know, we don't talk about the successes like Varsity. You mean, James, your book's coming out about Sicily soon, where obviously, you know, this is a bit of a proving ground for that, and it is much more successful. And yet, I don't know, it's just not something that we seem to fix on.
And Harry, I mean, I'm kind of, you know, it's interesting that Harold Macmillan in 1960 was saying, we really should stop all this nonsense with memorials about the Battle of Britain. I mean, you know, it's old hat now, you know, let's move on. And yet here we are, and you know, the Battle of Britain veterans are venerated, and you know, we mourn them every time another one passes away. you know, Spitfires are flying over Captain, now Colonel Tom Moore. You know, it is incredible, isn't it? And yet there's so many aspects of the Second World War which, and the RS part in it, which don't get a look in. We've already touched on Coastal Command. There's also still a kind of a bit of a black marker about the Strategic Air Campaign, isn't there, and the role of Bomber Command.
Yeah, I think, so just unpacking that a little bit, starting with the Battle of Britain, then I think it's really important to see that that is almost mythologized within the war itself. Yeah. Churchill plays a huge part in selling this, partly to get American support in. You know, they're glamorized, the fighter pilots then, and then in his subsequent histories of the war, he again expounds on that view, almost to double down on it, but also because he's got a lot of cachets associated with it already. And so he sells it once more, and his histories shaped a lot of the post-war debate about the Second World War. And so it's important, once again, in driving that. But it's interesting when, for instance, we've mentioned the Battle of Britain flight. When it was founded, it wasn't called that. It was when the Lancaster joined it that suddenly it became Battle of Britain flight, which is quite ironic. Yeah. And so, yeah, the strategic bombing campaign, by contrast, we like to minimize the conversation about it because it is controversial. But it's what the RAF was doing for most of the war. You know, 40,000 men, I think, lost doing it. A really important aspect of British air power. Americans then join in. You know, the whole debate about whether or not you could have done it a different way. For a long period, this was the only time we could strike Germany. I feel sorry for Peter because, of course, the army's not really doing very much against the German main force for a lot of this. You know, he's got a tough gig selling the army's role in this. But, you know, the RAF really is, you know, taking the fight into Germany, and it's being sold. The Blitz is, of course, still mythologized. We talk about Blitz spirit, but people didn't want to hear about Britain can take it by the end of 1941. They wanted to know that Britain could give it. And that's what Bomber Command was doing. And I think it is something which raises questions. I often have to give a talk to RTS Halton, the cadets who come in. And I explicitly draw this up. I ask them what they think about it after I've given them the facts. And it's interesting to see quite a lot of them say they wouldn't do it. I always admire those who put their hands up and say they would actually. But it is interesting.
Let me turn something on to you because I think it's interesting. I think it was the whole point of a government and war leaders is to win their war and to protect as many of their own citizens as they possibly can. And the Strategic Air Campaign is part of this steel not flesh policy, and it is, as you point out, the only real way you can strike it. I think one of the things about the way we teach the Second World War is that you have to be very careful not to kind of view things entirely through the prism of our contemporary viewpoint. And one of the issues that we have is that everyone's always constantly saying, "Got to make history relevant. You've got to make it relevant for the young," you know, as though they can't cope with kind of extreme violence or anything like that. I mean, you know, you have to look. Britain was fighting with what it had in a way that was protecting as many people as it possibly could. And one of those ways, and it has to be argued, was incredibly successful with strategic area bombing. Now, that did, of course, lead to a huge amount of destruction. But as the RAF repeatedly pointed out, the moment you stop the war, Hitler will stop bombing your cities, which, of course, wouldn't have happened to the Holocaust once the war had ended if it had ended in Hitler's favor. You know, I get the debates about Dresden, but even Dresden, you know, had 136 factories making war material. It was a hotbed of Nazism. It was a request by the Russians. It was a major rail hub. We didn't necessarily have to target the center of the old town, but as a military target, by 1945 standards, it was entirely justified.
Yeah, I think Dresden, I don't think we want to co-opt the conversation too much here. I think it's important to recognize there are two controversies within one. And often it's the larger strategic bombing campaign and what the objectives that should have been going for, which is covered within Dresden. And we need to discuss that. That's something people should have an opinion on. They should decide, was that a greater immorality than attacking Nazi Germany and potentially allowing it to succeed in its objectives? That's a view that people should have. I know that for Matthew, once again, I think that the only thing I'd add for the 45 is that it's a shame that we talk about Dresden and not, say, for instance, Operation Manor, where anniversary has just come up, humanitarian aid relief. It's of great relevance to what the RAF is doing today, of course, because it's still involved heavily in delivering humanitarian aid, flying into Holland, delivering 65,000 tons of food as they're starving. I think that goes into what the British
point, actually.
Yeah.
Really
I think that's what the Army and the Navy are doing as well in terms of supplying the logistics of it. That's something which we could go into as well, I think, for 45, because it's hugely important.
Yeah, Matthew, you want to say?
James, can I just come in? I mean, there's the issues about how current generations are led to understand the war. My personal low, I think, is U571, in which John Bon Jovi plays a key role in capturing Enigma machines, and you know, it's the event that never happened. Do you know what? I haven't even watched it. I've just read the reviews. I think the other issue, though, is how the services themselves, post-war and also today, have made use of the memory. And I think the Navy is, just as a kind of quick run through, is an interesting one. I mean, the Navy, I think, had a pretty exceptionally successful war on balance. You know, it was very aggressive, and it was, I think it learned some painful lessons from the First World War and so on. But I think it has made relatively little use, and I think it makes relatively little use in its institutional memory now about it. And it's interesting to ask why different services do different things. Clearly, Fleet Air Arm, you know, they have Taranto nights, and that's a part of their legend. I think the submarine service, you know, you start to see in the Second World War the veneration of the sort of the Jolly Rogers that each submarine will fly, and the sort of celebration of a pirate tradition. And you're able at once to call the U-boats pirates and killers of seamen, and then celebrate the service itself sinking. And there's still a bit of that. But the Navy itself, I think, is still probably burdened by looking back to Trafalgar and to Nelson, and that is its kind of founding touchstone. And they probably haven't had to create, and they also suffered, I think, in the First World War for venerating Nelson and looking for a Trafalgar moment. But it's just interesting looking at it. I don't think the Navy has made the use, perhaps, that other services have, and I'm thinking probably particularly, Harry, of RAF as a younger service having to create that touchstone. So I think there are inconsistencies there.
Well, I would agree with that. If you look at, sorry, just Peter, just very quickly. I mean, you know, one of the exceptional skill of the Royal Navy is second to none, really. I mean, the seamanship levels were extremely high, and because the Royal Navy was large in 1939 anyway, the world's largest navy. You know, you've got that ground base, so that when you need to rapidly expand, you've got experience and knowledge that can be spread through that expanding force. And, you know, if you want one example of the skill of Royal Navy, you've only got to go back to Normandy, that kind of constant reference point, and go to Long-sur-Mer and look at those Kriegsmarine, the German naval guns, and you can see where a shell from HMS Ajax has actually hit the protective shield of one of those guns and then smashed into the breach, knocking it out. Now, that's fired from 6 miles away. You've got no GPS, you've got no laser guiding. I mean, that is gunnery of just the highest skill. You know, and that's one of the reasons why we won the war.
Yeah, and I think Normandy, I just want to touch on that briefly, is that actually disproportionately, you know, we supplied the naval forces for Neptune. You know, we've done that similarly on the landings in Sicily. It was kind of a specialism that we developed.
Yes.
Okay, we were using new kinds of landing ships and landing craft that may well have been built in the US. But if you look at some of the continuity we've got there, if you look at somebody like Ramsey, his career, he's at Dunkirk, he's at Torch, he's in Sicily, he's there in Normandy, and he's at Walcheren as well.
Yeah.
The problem is he dies in January 45, doesn't get to write his memoirs or speak to this in later life. But it's a kind of specialism we offer. And you have to remember that we had then to keep the channel safe, you know, through the months post-June. We had to supply that logistics. And if you don't protect from E-boats, you get what happened at Slapton Sands, and you get, you know, hundreds of servicemen killed. So we don't like to tell that, because we like to depart from the beaches and tell what happened from there.
No, I think that's a point well made. But I think just to go back to the beaches, it's important to understand that of the kind of 1,213 warships, 892 of them were British. You know, of the 4,127 landing craft, 3,263 were British. You know, that is an absolutely monster contribution. However, we are drawing close to the end, so I suppose I'd just like to very, very briefly, just a sort of a minute or so, take each of you in turn and just ask you about what your plans are going forward for museums. I know that we are in certain times, but what would you hope that on this 75th anniversary of VE Day, that how do you see the legacy of the Second World War continuing? And Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting. It's probably, we benefited, I think, from First World War, the centenaries that we run through, from a bit more perspective. You know, as we start to move beyond living memory, I think that's going to be important. I think it will be important, and I think historians have done the job of telling some painful truths and having a rigorous examination. I don't think we've always been able to do that in our museums. So I think as we look ahead, we've got opportunities to do that. I think from my own perspective, I'd like to see an understanding of the imperial and kind of global aspects of the war and the Navy's role in that. You know, we focus on things that are about defending our island and so on, but there's an awful lot that exists outside the European theatre even. Yes. And the connection to the wealth that trade and ourselves as an imperial power give us, and that how that helps us sustain and fight the war, I think is important. So I guess I'm just hoping once we can get through this, if we can get through this, that we have an option to look at that. Yeah.
And Harry, what about you in the RAF museums?
It's a difficult question. One of the things I did before this discussion was I asked some of my friends who aren't as into history what they know about the Second World War. And sorry, embarrassed at the end of it. I haven't done a very good job apparently. But yeah, I think that's something which we need to recognise. But outside of the circles we have, where we're fascinated by history, military history, the general public don't necessarily have a deep knowledge of the Second World War, even for things which are crucial to the RAF, like the Battle of Britain. I think there's a lack of understanding about what that is. On the home front, it's better, partly because it's taught in schools, the Blitz, rationing, those are things people get more. But I think the bombing war, for instance, these are things we should engage with, because we should be asking people what they think about it, and also saying, what does this mean post-war? How did this shape what Britain did after the Second World War? The engagement with Europe, which Britain engaged with post-Second World War, was a complete break to its foreign policy for hundreds of years before that. Far more so, I think, than the Americans becoming involved in Europe, though that was dramatic. And of course, that special relationship is driven by the RAF's personal relationships with Air Force commanders in the US. I think we've got a really interesting story to tell. But technology as well, you know, the jet engine is, I think we've got to plug it. It's fostered by the RAF, and it's freely given to the Americans because there's a recognition that post-war there is a greater threat, and it's a really interesting aspect of the RAF and Britain's history, and I think shows just how cutting edge Britain's research was, and technology is crucial to the RAF throughout the Second World War.
Yeah, because I don't think a lot of people appreciate that the jet engines and jet technology by the end of by 1945, you know, we were the world leaders. I mean, it wasn't the Germans. The Germans might have had the Me-262 and all the rest of it, but in terms of jet engine technology, we were the leaders at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think starting before that, though, you know, you look at radar, that stuff which goes into every single aspect of the Second World War. We talked about Battle of the Atlantic. You know, it's Bowen's research, which develops the air surface vessel research, which is used in Coastal Command, but also goes into helping the Navy as well. I think the RAF's got a fantastic story to tell just from its technology cutting edge side of it.
Yeah. And Peter, finally.
So, I mean, at the National Army Museum, what we want to continue to do is to build on people's, you know, deep emotional connection to the Second World War. You know, this is a real foundation and touchstone, I think, of our national culture. And we want to show people that, you know, the story of Britain is very much bound up in the story of the army. We want to continue to nurture that. We want to continue to help people discover more about what their family members did, if they're curious. We want to help them learn more about the situations and the places that they were involved in. But looking ahead also, you know, our upcoming exhibition, which sadly was supposed to open next week and has now been pushed back slightly, is actually going to look at everything that happens after 1945. You know, what does Montgomery say? He says, now we've won the German war, but now we must win the peace. And for the army in particular, you know, yes, the fighting ended in Europe, at least on the 8th of May 1945. It continued in the Far East, and we will be continue to do a whole lot of programming and events looking towards VJ Day on the 15th of August of this year too. But our special exhibition is going to look at the role that the army played in Germany, in particular, because, you know, it went static and went firm, occupying this territory which it fought so hard to claim. And then it played a major role in rebuilding that country. Some enormous companies, for example, that we know around the world. Volkswagen was resurrected and revived as a result of the work of the British Army. But more importantly than that, and Harry alluded to it slightly, it was about standing on that front line in the Cold War as well, when Britain was prepared to stand and fight along various positions of its occupation zone in northwest Germany. And this became a major foundation point for global politics, because that was effectively the front line in the Cold War. And our exhibition will talk to people about that, show people what it was like to serve in the army that was there, and put that into the overarching context of this glorious British Army history that we're so proud to tell.
Well, thank you. I mean, you know, I have absolutely no doubt at all that COVID-19 will be beaten, and that your museums will all be open in swift order, and that people will be flooding back to them. And I would urge everyone to go and visit them, because every single one of them is just utterly fantastic. And I've spent many a happy hour there myself, I have to say. So this is going to be followed by a live Q&A crowdcast at 7 p.m. Thursday, the 7th of May. And then, Peter, you and I are back in action at 2 p.m. on VE Day 75 itself. That's Friday, the 8th of May. But in the meantime, Matthew, Harry, Peter, thank you all very much.
Thank you. Great talking to you. Cheers.